Hello people, this is New Sensei. One of the greatest things about the archery community is the willingness of its members to help others out. When you first choose your bow and pick it up, there are people who can guide you and give advice and wisdom every step of the way. By and large, all this is done with the best intentions. However, not everything you are told is useful. Sometimes advice is given based on what people have heard or read, and they can ignore the context and the specifics of this particular person or situation. So the advice becomes frivolous and sometimes actually damaging. So in this video, we're going to take a look at 10 things which you might be told or you might hear from somebody else, and why they might not actually be accurate or relevant to you.
Excuse me mate, that's not the right anchor. You need to have more contact with your anchor point. You need much more contact than that. You know, that's not a good anchor. What you need to do is to move your anchor under the jaw. That's what the Olympians use. But you know what? You're not using a sight, so you need to have a high anchor. Try and touch your cheek this time. You know, that's not going to work for you. You need a clear reference point. This time, put the finger in the corner of your mouth. Now, the mouth moves too much. What you need to do is to touch your tooth. Now, that the alignment's completely wrong there. You need to use your middle finger against your tooth. Nah, that's not good enough, mate. You need more contact.
There are reasons why certain anchor points are preferred over others. People who shoot barebow will often use a higher anchor point in order to use the arrow as a sighting tool. People who use sights will not need to use a reference point, so they will use a lower anchor for more stability or more reference points or to gain elevation. Others simply shoot what they are comfortable with, and that's really what the point of this is. Anchor points are very personalized. Every single shooter will have a slightly different anchor point. There will always be variations. Even if you touch the same point, it might be with a different part of the hand. For example, when I shoot instinctive, I actually don't use my finger to hook my mouth. In fact, my anchor point, which may look a little odd and why the camera angles don't show this very well, I feel more comfortable with the knuckle on my thumb against the line of my jaw here. So I do basically touch this, but as soon as I find that contact here, I know I'm basically in the right place. And that's the way I've developed a certain style of shooting for certain scenarios, and I can replicate that. And that is the number one point for anchor points. It must be consistent and repeatable, which means that if you have an anchor point which works for you, then you should use it. Anchor points are often a source of criticism when people observe you because it's visibly different to what people do. So people will jump in and say, you should do this rather than this. But it's change for the sake of change and not helpfulness. Now, if you recognize that somebody is struggling with an anchor point, then this is a good recommendation. They might want to experiment with various anchor points. But if someone has an anchor point that works for them, then there's no need to tell them to change it to something else.
Oi, mate, what are you doing? That's how you de-string a bow. Or erect the bow, you dumb idiot. Do it properly. No, what are you doing? Don't even think about that. That's just dumb. Use a bowstring for crying out loud. See? Isn't that easy? That's much better.
So you often hear that you must use a bowstringer to string and unstring your bow. This is generally a good recommendation. It is a safer option both for you and for your bow. It doesn't mean you have to. Do remember that before bowstringers were invented, people had to string their bows by hand, and that is actually completely fine. Now, there are certain situations where I would say it's generally okay to disregard the whole bowstringer thing. The main thing is that you have to know what you're doing. Now, there's a difference between an expert who's done this thousands of times routinely and a new shooter who has no idea what they're doing. For example, for most bows which I use, which are light draw weights, either my own personal bows, or my fiberglass bows, or the club recurves, where there's like so many of them, you don't have time to really go through a bowstring and unstring each one. As long as you can do a method safely, it's okay. I normally push-pull for most of my club recurves, and there's nothing wrong with that. The bow isn't broken, nothing's twisted, and so on. And that's fine, because I know how to do it safely. Now, I have seen people with their new bows who think push-pull means they basically ram down on the bow and the riser, and then bends the bow and they put the string on. And that's when I go, holy crap, take it easy. That bow is like, it's so twisted. I'm surprised it doesn't snap. But these people don't know how to do it properly. So they are at much greater risk of actually damaging their bow. For people who do know how to do it properly, there's nothing wrong with push and pull. It might not be the safest option, but it is often the most practical option. And if you know how to do it properly, and you can safely handle a bow, then it's okay. You don't need to have a heart attack if you see someone doing that. There are certain situations where I would definitely use the bowstringer. For me, if I'm using one of my really good bows, and I don't want to damage them, or if I'm using a very high draw weight, and that's anything above 40 pounds, that's when I would use a bowstringer. For the draw weight issue, it's mostly because I don't have the strength to confidently do a push-pull, so I find it much easier and safer to use a bowstringer. And ease and safety are actually the two main reasons why the bowstringer is highly recommended. But like I said before, it is highly recommended, but I wouldn't go to the point where I would say you must use a bowstringer. Perhaps you should use one, but I wouldn't say must, because you've got to put trust in the person using the bow. It's their bow. If they know what they're doing, then they can do it safely.
Your stance is okay, but you should try an open stance. Put 1 foot forward, 1 foot back, and that's your open stance. Try that, that's much better.
Yes, the open stance. Watch any tutorial on YouTube on how to shoot, and the presenter will most likely be a big proponent of the open stance. Some will just say, use it. Others will make a very specific guide on how to align your feet at the right angle and the right spacing. To be fair, the open stance is the most commonly used stance, and for a good reason. It is often said to be the most stable stance, and it is the most natural stance. Most things you do, whether it's in shooting or in martial arts or just daily life, are better done with an open stance. It helps you triangulate your weight and position, it allows you to shift your weight accordingly, and in general, it gives you much more stability while using an open stance. Whether that is the best stance or the only stance to use is up for debate. People who use the square stance often fall into one of two camps. Either they are absolute beginners who are taught by the club instructor to stand perpendicular to the line, or they are professional Olympic archers who are trained by their coach to use a square stance. For beginners, this does make sense. It's often easier to teach a lot of beginners to stand with 1 foot on either side of the line, because people will often move their feet after the shot. They'll take an arrow or they'll step off the line, so it's hard for them to repeat the same open stance unless they've got a lot of familiarity with stances or they've done a lot of shooting before. So the square stance is often the easiest to teach somebody. Interestingly, certain coaching manuals will actually recommend the square stance, and there's another good reason for that. It's alignment. The open stance means you need to impart a greater upper body twist, basically, and that helps generate more back tension, and that's a desirable thing. So this does use some torque in your body to get more power in your shot, and that's actually a big recommendation. However, this can make it more difficult for a shooter to get the right shoulder alignment. So in certain coaching manuals and certain coaching styles, they actually push the square stance. A good example of this might be the Korean Olympic archery team. You will see many of their shooters actually stand in a square stance and shoot perfectly fine. Why we don't replicate this? Because we have the idea where open is better. But it's not necessarily so. As long as your stance is consistent and repeatable and helps you get the right alignment, then either stance can work just as well. Most people will probably go from a square stance to an open stance as they get more comfortable and they can get the alignment much more easily. That said, just because somebody is using a square stance doesn't mean they need to change to an open stance. So advising them to do so isn't really helping. Let them do so either on their own feel and volition or based on their coach's feedback.
Nah, mate, your arm is way too straight. You need to put a bend in your arm. That's the right way of doing things.
This one is interesting because you do see quite a few top-level competitive shooters use a bent arm in their process. And in some areas, the bent arm is the standard method and people do it just fine. So when a bent arm shooter looks at someone with a straight arm, they will say, no, that's wrong, bend your arm. However, a straight arm is not a form fault. It is a very common, if not standard, way of learning to use a bow. There is nothing wrong with this. In many ways, it is a better way to hold the bow and maintain that skeletal alignment. The main key for this issue is you can keep your arm straight, but you don't hyperextend your arm. Another reason why this is often recommended is because it helps you avoid getting hit by the string. That's not so much an arm straightness issue, it's more about elbow rotation. That will help clear the path of the string, so you don't have to bend your arm to avoid getting hit. There are certain challenges with a bent arm. It might affect your skeletal alignment. Good archery alignment is based on the bones joined together rather than the muscles. When you put a bend in your arm, you're taking the load off your elbow and you're putting it onto your muscles, and that can be a much weaker and less stable platform. In the end, it's up to the individual. Everybody has a slightly different elbow. Some people will have a lot of trouble maintaining a straight arm and will hyperextend naturally, so they might just use a bent arm. And bent arm works fine. If it works for you, then do it. But just because somebody uses a straight arm doesn't mean they're wrong. You do have to recognize there are differences in the way people are taught.
Oh, dude, look how long your arrows are. That looks totally stupid. You need to cut them down to 1 to 2 inches more than your draw length.
When it comes to arrow length, there's really only one thing you should keep in mind. Don't get arrows that are too short. That's really bad. But if your arrows are long or they're uncut, then it doesn't really matter that much, especially if you're just starting out and you're learning. The length of the arrow would not affect your learning process, it would not affect your shot that much, and it's often easy to get long uncut arrows rather than cut them down to a size which you might grow out of. So while that recommendation of 1 to 2 inches longer than your draw length might be a good reference point or a good guideline, it's not required. Now, if you're a more advanced shooter and you want to pay more attention to your front of center and whatever for your setup, then that's different. You will need to customize your arrows a bit more carefully. But for a learner, length isn't that important. The more important thing to watch out for is spine. Sometimes you need a slightly longer arrow to have the right tune for your bow, and that's okay. That's something you have to accept. Even if you're using an Olympic style bow with a clicker and you need a certain length, then you might have to get a longer clicker. But again, Don't try to aim for that exact length that's recommended. Spine is more important, as long as the arrow isn't too short.
Oh, mate, what's with that puny 25-pound bow? Man up and use a real bow. You see how good that bow feels? See how fast it comes off your fingers? That's a real man's bow.
There is a certain satisfaction that comes from using a heavier draw weight. You get the oomph on the bow, the flat line of the arrow, the thunk in the target. All these things are extremely gratifying. That said, we can't assume that every person wishes to go down this path. Many people are just as happy shooting a light bow, shooting for hours and trying their hardest to hit the target. And a heavier draw weight can actually take away from that satisfaction. I've spoken a lot about draw weight egos, and without repeating myself, higher draw weights does not mean you are a better archer. A better archer is someone who is more able to hit the target, but more importantly, you have to have fun. If this is fun to you, then sure, use a higher draw weight, but don't make it out to be something that you're missing out on if someone chooses not to use a high draw weight.
You've got too many fingers on the bow. That's really bad form. That means you're gonna torque the bow. What you gotta do is to only use 2 fingers on the riser. See? 1 and 2. Look how much easier it is. See? That's gonna be a better shot.
As with everything else, this has a good reason. Many people who start doing archery have a problem with holding the grip too tightly. That's called a death grip. They put so much tension in their hand and pressure on the bow, it causes them to shake and then it causes them to torque. And that can be very tiring and harmful to your shooting. The common advice is to use a finger sling. That allows you to put your fingers away from the riser and the sling retains the bow so you don't drop it. But if you're not using a sling, then people will often say use your index finger to cover the riser. So you have minimal contact and you have the right pressure point on the riser. And again, this is good advice. This does help you get the right alignment and the right pressure without squeezing the bow. But you don't have to do this. You can shoot like this just fine, as long as you don't apply excessive tension on the bow. So just because you can apply too much tension doesn't mean you will. And there are many shooters who are confident shooting like this, and there's nothing wrong with that. More importantly, you need to retain control of the bow, and sometimes only having one finger over the grip might give you too loose a grip, especially if you're using a higher draw weight where you need a bit more control on the riser to keep it level. So it is good advice, but it doesn't have to apply as a blanket rule to every single shooter.
Oh look, you're shooting way too fast. You're just bringing it up there and letting go as soon as you get to your anchor point. That's really bad shooting. You gotta take your time. Look at this. See, that was better, but you need to hold for even longer. Aim more, feel it. See, that was a good shot, wasn't it?
Holding for longer, again, is often good advice. It allows you to check your aim a bit more carefully, allows you to consolidate the expansion a bit more, and often you will find that within a certain frame, you will shoot your best shots if you hold for that bit longer. Not holding too long, just a little bit longer than what you normally do. This isn't always the case, and I refer with respect to instinctive shooters who have practiced their shooting for months and years. If you feel the shot is already on target, then that's when you do the shot. Holding for longer isn't necessarily going to help you do a better shot. And for some people whose natural tempo is a little quicker, then holding for longer might actually worsen their shot. It's up to the archer. If the archer feels that they have a good process and they can repeat it and they can shoot accurately, then leave them be. That's okay. If you find, again, that somebody is struggling with shooting accurately and you feel that they should try to hold for a bit longer to see if they shoot better, that's a good recommendation. But don't push people to hold for longer just because it looks too fast to you. Again, it's something which, if you can identify it's causing problems, then it's a safe suggestion. But it's not, again, a blanket rule. Over time, the archer will recognize if they need to hold the shot a bit longer, and this will depend on every individual shot, and they will recognize if the shot isn't worth making.
If you're gonna buy your first bow, you gotta get an ILF riser. An ILF riser means that you can use any limb you want that has ILF. It's much better for you and you can upgrade and get more limbs later.
I often see this advice coming from people who have only shot target ILF bows. Not every takedown bow is ILF, and it doesn't need to be. A lot of the beginner bows are not ILF, and some of the really good traditional bows are not ILF. Not everybody who starts archery wants to buy the shiny sport style target bows. Many people just want the basic wooden recurves, others want the really nice fancy hunting bows or traditional bows. So ILF is not something I would push to people. It's nice to inform people what it is and why it's good, but not everyone needs to get one. And again, if you've only shot target ILF, you're not really in a position to recommend bows from a limited part of the spectrum to someone who's looking for something else. So do be considerate over what people actually want. Don't push ILF. As much as I love ILF for target shooting and its versatility, I respect, again, that not every bow needs to be ILF. I have no demonstration for this one, but it's just something that you hear every time someone makes a suggestion. It's do whatever works for you. And it might be in the concept of fun and enjoyment, or it might be with the idea that archery is individual and personalized and your technique will be different to somebody else's. Is this good advice? Yes and no. While there isn't a single right way to do archery, there are definitely wrong ways. There are ways which are less effective, there are ways which are less efficient, and sometimes more dangerous. So when people say that you should be doing things a certain way, and assuming good faith here, it doesn't mean they're dictating their superior kind of archery. You have that freedom to shoot the way you want to. However, there may be things that you are doing which may be alarming to somebody watching you because they recognize something they've done before, perhaps a sign that there's a mistake happening or an injury waiting to happen or an accident waiting to happen. So for this reason, I'm not going to do a blanket statement saying do whatever you want. I think people misuse that as I can do whatever and no one can stop me. And that's true to an extent, but at the same time, people who know more than you are probably in a better position to give good advice. I think the fine line here is the intent behind saying that. If it's done so to recognize and respect different styles of shooting, then that is a truism. You can do it whatever way works for you. But if it's done defensively to protect or to shield yourself from criticism and to say that my style is better than yours, then I think that's a misuse of that phrase. So like with the whole Assassin's Creed saying nothing is true, everything is permitted, that can be misused. It doesn't mean you have the complete freedom to do whatever you want with no consequences. What it does mean is that you are allowed to be open-minded and think about all the possibilities. So that's 10 things which I often see or hear that you can actually ignore. A lot of the time, as I said before, this is done with good intentions. So people are trying to help. But my advice to people trying to help is that you consider the context a bit more carefully. Think about the prior experience of the person, what their competency is, what they're trying to achieve and do in archery, rather than repeat things you've seen or read elsewhere. Because again, these things might be relevant to you, but not necessarily relevant or helpful to somebody else. For people who are asking for help and are receiving this sort of advice from people, again, it's good advice, it comes from strong fundamentals, and it's generally very safe to follow. You shouldn't have to follow these things as law. People don't have the right to tell you how to do things, and if you feel that you think that your way is slightly different or slightly better or works better for you, then you have the freedom to do what you think is right. And I am a firm believer that people should learn from experience. We can guide you on your journey, but you have to take the steps. Anyway, this is New Sensei. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.